Welcome to another episode of Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm Dr. Tom Kennedy. I'm doing this series on cells, and this is part 2 for prokaryotic cells, because in the last one I talked about their key evolutionary innovations. Now in this lecture, I want to focus on prokaryotic diversity. Now of course, there's basically no way that I could cover all of prokaryotic diversity. I mean, prokaryotes are everywhere, and one of the things we've learned in the last few decades from our ability to sequence DNA is that they're diverse. We don't even know exactly how many different types of bacteria there are and what those bacteria are doing. I mean, you have millions of these, structurally simple cells, and of course, their metabolism, and their different types of metabolism, they're doing all kinds of things. We still don't know what they're doing. So I can't focus on everything, but I hope to hit some highlights to kind of show that bacteria are really everywhere. And I also want to talk about why that diversity is important, and it's important to us for several different reasons. Okay, so here's our learning objective. Know the importance of prokaryotic diversity. Like I said, said know the importance of it, not know prokaryotic diversity, because that would be kind of hard, but we can at least introduce ourselves to it. To me, this is pretty wild. If you were to take a handful of dirt, it's gardening season, right? We get our hands in that soil, and you smell that soil and it's got that nice earth smell to it. Well, that's a function of bacteria. And in your handful of dirt are more bacteria than there have been people that have ever lived on this planet. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, there are more bacteria cells living in a handful of dirt than there are 800 billion people that have basically ever lived and died on this planet. So bacteria, they are abundant. They are everywhere. And here's another good factoid for you. You can take a glass of seawater, especially a glass of seawater near land, where there's lots of nutrients in the water. And you might take a drop of that seawater. We can, of course, quantify that drop as a milliliter. It's not very much. Just think a drop of rain. And there could be millions of bacteria living in that seawater. And, I have to ask, who are they? What are those bacteria doing? How are they eking out a living? And what are they eking out a living on? What makes them different? Now let's come to us, right? It's been estimated that bacteria might outnumber us 10 to 1. So if we have 17 trillion cells, we might have close to 100 trillion bacteria living in us and on us. And in fact, we have about 6 or 8 pounds of us as bacteria. I know, that's a lot. So we're more microbial than you think, right? And these microbes, they are very important, and they're a very important part of our body. We have these symbiotic relationships with them, and wow, they just do so much. They're important for our health. We know that a high fiber diet, improves gut microbe diversity, and in the last decade or so, we know that a high gut microbe diversity from eating a plant-based diet high in fiber helps maintain health versus a diet with junk food and soda and high caloric processed food can limit the diversity of your gut microbiome and can subsequently affect your health. And we're learning that our body communicates with the bacteria in our gut, and guess what, they also communicate with us as well. They're producing neurotransmitters and sending out signals that our brain is reading and going, oh yeah, I'm hungry. Feed me some sugar. If you eat a lot of sugar, right? I mean, like I said, there's a lot of interaction with our gut microbiome that is affecting so many aspects of our life, from allergies to asthma to your propensity for getting colon cancer to constipation to affecting type 2 diabetes and obesity. Now, all of those conditions have lots of factors that go into them, environmental and genetic. And of course, our gut microbiome is determined also by genetics and environment. So it gets complicated, but we know that the gut microbiome definitely is involved with lots of these things. Even our mood Even our mood is and somewhat affected by our gut microbiome. That's crazy. And of course, there's good bacteria. I'm not going to get into the good and bad bacteria here. You can see on this graph, there's like bifidobacteria is good for you. And a lot of these things can help us break down the foods we eat. They can produce nutrients that we need, like vitamin K. And some of them may also prevent bad bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, from infecting us. And of course, there's other things that the bacteria are doing. And we know that some bacteria are not healthy for us, like Clostridium or Helicobacter pylori, which causes ulcers. And of course, because we've come to understand that our gut microbiome is very important, we are interested in things like probiotics, which you would get from fermented food like kimchi or sauerkraut or yogurt. And yes, they're good for you. They can help out with your gut microbiome. And then something like a prebiotic is giving the gut microbiome what it needs to be successful, like a healthy diet of berries and vegetables. Okay. Now, bacteria often get a bad rap because they cause disease. And if you don't believe me that they have a bad rap, walk down the soap aisle and you'll read all your soaps that promise to kill 99.9% of all germs or bacteria or whatever. Yeah, I mean, well, if you've got 100 million bacteria, you kill 99.9%, you still have 100,000, right? That's still a lot of bacteria. But things like Streptococcus, Clostridium, Treponema, Vibrio cholera, Helicobacter pylori, Clostridium, Streptococcus, or Streptobacillus. These bacteria do cause lots of diseases. And of course, we're worried about the emergence of antibiotic-resistant diseases. So, bacteria are important for causing human suffering. But we tend to forget that they're also incredibly important for carrying out lots of ecological functions. For one, they break down things, lots of things. And if it weren't for, these bacteria, heterotrophic bacteria breaking down all this organic material, a lot of it would just be locked up in dead organic matter and not made available to new plants and animals. So bacteria keep things cycling through the ecosystem, nutrients cycling through it. Not energy though, but the nutrients. And then, not only do we need to recycle nutrients, sometimes we need additional nutrients. And some bacteria are able to basically take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into forms that plants can use. And then, animals eat plants, and then that's how we get our nitrogen. So, So nitrogen is often limiting in ecosystems. That's why plants have like nitrosomes that can form these symbiotic relationships with them, and they can fix nitrogen into the soil and improve the soil quality. So that's an important ecological function. Okay, in addition to ecological functions, I keep saying this, they're everywhere. They're not primitive. And a lot of prokaryotes can live in very extreme environments. And this is the hot springs from Yellowstone. And you can see these thermophilic bacteria living in hot water. I mean, water that's, 130, 140, 160 degrees. That's pretty hot. And in fact, up until the 1970s or so, it was basically thought that life couldn't exist much warmer than 130, 140 degrees, because beyond that, the proteins required for life to exist would denature. They would fall apart. They would be rendered useless. And that includes the proteins involved with DNA replication. So, you've got these DNA polymerases that replicate DNA. Well, in the 1970s, these microbiologists, they were wandering around Yellowstone, and of course, they found these bacteria living in very hot water, like 160 degrees. And they called this bacteria Thermos aquaticus, which basically means hot water. Thermos aquaticus. Well, they were pretty smart guys, right? Because they realized there was this field of learning how to sequence DNA. So one of the things, if you're going to sequence DNA, You do a PCR, polymerase chain reaction. Well, in the early 1980s, I think, about that time, the exact time isn't important. What they realized is that the DNA polymerase in this heat-loving thermophilic bacteria, Thermos aquaticus, could be used under very hot conditions. So in a PCR, if you've ever done a PCR, you warm it up, you cool it down. You warm it up, you cool it down. Well, you warm it up to 150 or so degrees, the DNA comes apart, and then the DNA polymerase from this little bacteria called Thermos aquaticus copies your DNA, you cool it, now you've got 2 copies. You get the idea. And every sequence of DNA, right, that we've ever done for 40 years has used something called Taq polymerase in your PCR to amplify your sequence of DNA so it can be sequenced. Wow, Taq polymerase. T for Thermos, AQ for aquaticus. So here it is. This little bacteria living in the hot springs of Yellowstone was revolutionary in our ability to sequence DNA. I know. I think they sold the patent years ago for like $300 million. I mean, this was an incredible find that just revolutionized our science. And like I said, so that just goes to show some of the importance of diversity, because you never know when some unassuming critter, bacteria, or even a tree or whatever might hold the key to something really useful for us. I know that's anthropocentric, that's, human-centric, but that's okay. And of course, to show that bacteria are everywhere, there's another bacteria called Acidobacillus acidicus. And of course, this can live in almost boiling water, 175 degrees, and very acidic as well, a pH of 2. And on the opposite end, extremophiles like a psychrophile, they can live in very, very cold environments like Antarctica. And in fact, in the 90s, they discovered bacteria living in the rocks, frozen in Antarctica. And I remember this guy at Florida State, I can't remember if he's a professor or a postdoc or something, but he had a shirt that said, Antarctic rocks are alive and well, because they just discovered rocks living inside of the Antarctica rocks down there. Antarctica's got a lot of ice. They have drilled 2 miles below the ice. Guess what? They find bacteria. We've drilled below the oceans. Guess what we find? Bacteria. I mean, the prokaryotes are just everywhere. We even find different types of lithoautotrophs. Lithoautotroph means rock-eating bacteria. And of course, you can see these lithoautotrophic bacteria coming out of these glaciers down in Antarctica. It's just astounding. And you also have other bacteria called endoliths. Endoliths are bacteria that can live inside of rocks like the ones that we see in Antarctica. And of course, I didn't mention this, but there are also bacteria in prokaryotes that live in incredibly salty environments as well. So, bacteria everywhere on this planet. Prokaryotes, I should say. I know I keep saying bacteria, and I'm forgetting that the archaeans are the true extremophiles, but so are bacteria. And, this to me is very exciting that we can find life almost everywhere on the surface of this planet, and even hundreds or even thousands of feet below the surface, whether it's ice or even where I'm standing right now, there's bacteria, thousands of feet below me, all the way down to the bedrock. And for those of you that know me, know that I really enjoy astrobiology. I'm excited about finding life. And of course, studying bacteria and other prokaryotes might help us find life in the solar system and where we might find it. And of course, Mars is always one of the top candidates. There was clearly water on its surface. There was rock-water interfaces. The planet was clearly geologically active in its past. So we have a potential of finding life on Mars. And but we may not find life. It's a dead planet. It's oxidized. At least the surface is. It lost its atmosphere billions of years ago. It hasn't had water on its surface for billions of years. It doesn't have any magnetic field to deflect the solar wind away from it. So if life is there, it's almost certainly below the rocks, living in underground water, kind of eking out a living there. Probably not super abundant. And of course, back in the 1990s when they were discovering these Antarctic bacteria living in the rocks, they discovered the Allen Hills meteor that came from Mars. They find these tiny little structures in there that they thought were probably Martian life. They announced that before the peer review process. There was a lot of doubt cast on whether or not that little structure was just a mineral deposit versus prokaryotes or some type of Martian life. Probably not Martian life, probably some type of mineral deposit, most likely. Not saying no. There's one chance in a million. So I'm saying there's a chance. Europa is a moon of Jupiter. It's clearly got water underneath that liquid. It's got water underneath the ice. It's got potentially what we think of a rock-water interface, which we need for life. It's clearly geologically active, so Europa might be a good shot for finding life. And in fact, we are now assembling something called the Europa Clipper to get us back to Jupiter to study whether or not Europa might have life on it. Further out is a small moon of Saturn called Enceladus. Just take a look at the moon. You can see that one side of it is old, the other side is relatively new. It's got liquid water. This is a geologically active icy moon. And when you have geologically active icy moons, complete with geysers that are spewing out water similar to our water in our oceans, well, we get excited because we know you need liquid water in some type of a geologically active body for life. However, we have no idea how long Enceladus has been like this, versus Europa has likely been geologically active for the length of the solar system, almost 4.5 billion years. And then one of the most exciting moons in the solar system, there's lots of them, but Titan is a moon of Saturn, and Titan has liquid on its surface. It rains, it's got lakes, it's got rivers, but not of water, but of liquid hydrocarbons like methane and ethane. And of course, all of that is on top of ice. And then underneath that ice, we think is liquid water. Yes, I know. So there's liquid on the surface, ice, and then liquid water underneath that, and some type of geological processes keeping it with a very thick atmosphere. So if we were to find life on the surface of Titan, it would be just completely different than anything we've ever seen, because instead of being in water, it would of course be in liquid hydrocarbons. However, there's evidence that yes, there's a liquid ocean underneath the ice with all of the surface stuff on top of it. And that's pretty wild. And an outside shot here is Venus. I know, the surface of Venus is 800 degrees. It's like 30 atmospheres, and you could melt lead on it and it rains sulfuric acid. I mean, that's hell on Earth, right? Or hell on Venus, actually. But, that's new. I mean, that's only in the last billion or so years. Venus is relatively the same size as the Earth. It likely had oceans. It's geologically active. So life could have gotten started there. It's unlikely to be on the surface, but it could be hanging out in the clouds. Like we have bacteria living miles above us in our clouds. Venus could have the same thing as well. And then, of course, there are all these exoplanets that we're discovering, thousands of them. We now have the James Webb Telescope up, 1 million miles from us. And basically, it's working so far. They've aligned the mirrors as of March of 2022. They've got one dot instead of 18, so the mirrors are aligned. And we should be able to start using it this summer. And it could potentially analyze the atmospheres of these exoplanets and look for the signs of life, like a lot of oxygen in them, that you would get from bacteria or some type of photosynthetic process. All right. So as you can tell, the diversity of prokaryotes is incredibly important, not just for ecosystem services that it provides, not just to humans, but to everybody. Also, diversity is very important for our gut microbiome. Diversity is important for making new discoveries. And of course, the diversity of prokaryotes can help inform us about where we might find life elsewhere in the solar system or even in the universe. Okay, until next time, this has been Tom Kennedy Science. and stay curious.